There's a moment, and most people have had it, even if they've never named it, where you catch your own reflection somewhere unexpected. Not in a bathroom mirror, but in the middle of a conversation, or sitting in traffic, or lying awake at 3 in the morning when the house is completely still. And something in you goes quiet. And in that quiet, a question rises. Not loudly, almost like a whisper. Is this actually me? Not your name, not your job title, not the version of you that laughs at the right moments and says the right things and fits, mostly, into the life you've constructed. But you, the thing underneath all of that, the one doing the watching. Most of us flinch away from that question. We make coffee, we check our phones, we find something, anything, to fill the space. Because on some level, we already suspect what the answer might be, and it frightens us. Carl Jung spent his entire life sitting with that question, refusing to look away from it. And what he found, what he mapped painstakingly across decades of clinical work and personal crisis and deep, sometimes terrifying self-examination, was not a comfortable answer. It was something far more interesting than comfort. He called it individuation. Jung was born in 1875 in a small Swiss village, the son of a Protestant minister who had long since stopped believing in God, but kept performing the rituals anyway. That image, the hollow performance of a faith that no longer lived inside the performer, stayed with Jung. It became, in a way, the central problem of his entire psychology. How many people, he would eventually ask, are doing exactly that? Not with religion necessarily, but with their lives. Going through the motions of a self they chose or that was chosen for them at an age when they had no real power to choose. He wasn't interested in making people feel better about themselves. He was interested in making people real. There's a difference, a profound one. Individuation is the process, and it is a process, not a destination, not an achievement, by which a person becomes who they actually are, not who their parents needed them to be, not who their culture rewarded them for being, not the edited, polished, socially acceptable version that made it through childhood with the fewest bruises. The real self, in all its contradiction and depth and difficulty. Think about what happens to a child, an actual child, not an abstraction. From the moment they arrive, the world begins the process of shaping them, teaching them what is acceptable and what isn't, which parts of themselves earn love, and which parts earn silence, or punishment, or that particular look of disappointment that cuts deeper than any words. A little boy cries. Someone tells him boys don't cry. He learns. He tucks that away. A little girl is loud, opinionated, difficult, and someone tells her to be more pleasant. She learns too. She modulates herself. She smooths out the edges that made people uncomfortable. This is necessary, to some degree. We are social animals. We need to function within communities. Jung understood this, but he also understood the cost. Because all of those tucked away pieces don't disappear. They don't just evaporate because we learned not to show them. They go underground. They form what Jung called the shadow, the repository of everything we were told, explicitly or implicitly, was not acceptable. Not just our darkness, our unlived life, our abandoned potential. The artist in the accountant, the wildness in the carefully controlled professional, the grief in the person who always seems fine. And what's exiled grows strange. What's buried grows roots in the dark. The persona. Jung borrowed the word from the ancient Greek. It literally means mask, the physical mask worn by actors in theater. And that's exactly what it is. The face we construct for the world. The character we learn to play. The persona is not entirely a lie. It contains real elements of who we are. But it is selective, curated. It's the parts of us that work best in public. The warmth we show at parties, the competence we show at work, the patience we perform for our families, even when we're falling apart inside. The problem is not that the persona exists. The problem is when we forget it's a mask. And this happens more often than we like to admit. You spend long enough being the reliable one, the funny one, the successful one, and eventually you start to believe that is you, that there is nothing underneath it. Or worse, you start to suspect there is something underneath it, and the suspicion terrifies you, and so you become more rigidly the persona, more perfectly the performance, working harder and harder to maintain the surface. That exhaustion people feel, the particular bone-deep tiredness that doesn't go away with sleep, that's often the cost of maintaining a self that doesn't quite fit. Here's something Jung noticed that strikes me as painfully accurate. Most people arrive at their 30s or 40s, sometimes later, sometimes a brutal bit earlier, and discover that the life they have built, the life they constructed so carefully according to the specifications they were given, feels hollow. Not necessarily bad, not catastrophically wrong, just hollow. They have the things they were supposed to want, or they're working diligently toward them. The career is on track, the relationships are functional, the image is intact, and yet. Jung called this the midlife crisis, though not in the comedic way the phrase has come to be used. The sports car, the affair, the desperate youth chasing. He saw it as something more serious and more profound. The first genuine confrontation with the question of who you actually are, as opposed to who you've been told to be. The tragedy is that many people respond to this confrontation by running from it, rearranging the surface. New partner, new job, new city, more achievement, more acquisition, more distraction. Anything rather than sitting down inside themselves and doing the real, uncomfortable work of asking why the emptiness is there, what it's made of, what it might be pointing toward. Why do most people never complete, or even truly begin, individuation? It's worth sitting with this question honestly. Partly, it's because the process is genuinely difficult. It asks you to encounter parts of yourself you have spent years, sometimes decades, carefully avoiding. The shadow is not full of pleasant things. It contains your shame, your rage, your envy, the emotions that felt too dangerous or too unseemly to acknowledge. Looking at them clearly, without flinching, without immediately explaining them away, requires a courage that is not dramatic or theatrical. It's quieter than that, and in some ways harder. But partly, and this is the thing Jung kept returning to, it's because society has no particular interest in your individuation. This is not a conspiracy. It's not malicious. It's structural. Economies function better when people are predictable consumers. Institutions function better when people are reliable conformists. Families sometimes function better, on the surface, in the short term, when their members stay in the roles they've always occupied. The person who starts asking deep questions about who they are makes others uncomfortable. Not because their questions are wrong, but because they implicitly raise the same questions in everyone around them. And most people would rather not be asked. So the pressure to remain a persona, to stay nicely within the approved version of yourself is constant and largely invisible. It doesn't announce itself. It just shapes you, quietly, persistently, year after year. Relationships are where individuation gets truly complicated, because the people we love and the people who love us often have a very specific idea of who we are. And when we begin to change, when we begin to reclaim parts of ourselves that were submerged, it disrupts the agreement. Jung observed something that sounds almost harsh until you sit with it. We are often attracted to people who carry the qualities we have repressed in ourselves. The very controlled person falls for someone spontaneous and unpredictable. The intellectual is drawn to someone sensual and embodied. The caretaker is drawn to someone who seems to need saving. And for a while, this works beautifully. The other person carries what you can't yet access in yourself. They seem to complete you. But if you never do the work of integrating those qualities, if you never develop your own spontaneity, your own wildness, your own capacity to be cared for, then eventually the dynamic curdles. The spontaneous partner starts to feel irresponsible. The sensual partner becomes someone to be vaguely ashamed of. The person you saved becomes a burden. What was once captivating becomes intolerable. Not because they changed, but because you were never in love with them exactly. You were in love with what they carried for you, and relationships can't sustain that weight indefinitely. The path through this, not around it, through it, is to turn toward your own interior, to ask what the attraction is really pointing at, to ask what in yourself has gone unlived, uncultivated, unexplored, and why. That is deeply uncomfortable work. It is also the work that makes genuine love possible, because you can only truly meet another person when you're actually present as yourself, not as the persona, not as someone performing the role of partner or parent or friend, but as the actual, complicated, contradictory human being you are. Jung died in 1961. He never had a smartphone. He never experienced the particular psychological conditions of a world where everyone's life is curated in real time, where approval is quantified in likes and follows, where the persona has been given its own separate platform and can be maintained and polished around the clock. The conditions he described are not new, but the technology has supercharged them to a degree he couldn't have imagined. Social media doesn't create the persona problem, but it deepens it enormously. Because now you don't just perform yourself for the people in the room, you perform yourself for everyone, simultaneously, all the time. The gap between the curated self and the actual self can grow to extraordinary proportions, and that gap has weight. It has psychological cost. And here's what's particularly insidious. The more you invest in the performance, the more followers you accumulate, the more the identity is built on the external image, the more frightening the authentic self becomes. Because the authentic self is unpolished, it's contradictory. It doesn't have good lighting. It can't be cropped. Modern society also, Jung would note, has systematically dismantled many of the rituals and structures that once helped people navigate the interior life. Religion, for all its flaws, gave people frameworks for grappling with meaning, with mortality, with the parts of existence that can't be optimized. Rites of passage once marked the transitions that force identity questions, the passage from child to adult, from single person to partner, from parent to elder. We have dismantled much of that and replaced it with productivity, with self-optimization, with the peculiar modern faith that everything, including the self, can be improved by the right system, the right habit stack, the right morning routine. Jung would look at all of this, kindly but clearly, and say, you are solving the wrong problem. So, what would Jung actually say to someone today? Not as a guru dispensing wisdom, but as a psychologist who took the interior life with complete seriousness. He would say, pay attention to what disturbs you. Not the things that annoy you mildly, but the things that affect you, with a force disproportionate to their actual significance. The colleague who infuriates you in a way you can't quite explain. The type of person you find yourself dismissing with unusual contempt. The qualities in others that seem to make you genuinely uncomfortable. These reactions are information. They are the shadow signaling itself. They are pointing, often, at something in you that you haven't been willing to look at. He would say, take your dreams seriously. Not literally, he wasn't naive, but seriously. The unconscious speaks in images, in symbols, in narratives that don't follow waking logic. If you consistently dream of being chased or lost, or of returning to a house you don't recognize, there is something in that. Not something you can decode from a dream dictionary, but something worth sitting with, worth wondering about. He would say, slow down. The hyperactivity of modern life, the constant stimulation, the scheduled busyness, the productivity obsession, is in part a collective strategy for avoiding the interior. You can't hear what's true about yourself over the noise. You need silence. You need solitude, not as a luxury, but as a necessity. Not as self-indulgence, but as the basic condition for self-knowledge. He would say, the goal is not to become a better version of what you already are. The goal is to become more fully what you actually are, which is a different project entirely, and a more demanding one, and ultimately, a more rewarding one. And perhaps most importantly, he would say, the work is never finished. Individuation is not an achievement you unlock. It's a direction you move in. A continuous, lifelong orientation toward honesty, with yourself, about yourself, that deepens over time and never fully resolves. The wholeness he spoke of was not perfection. It was integration. It was the capacity to hold your contradictions without being destroyed by them. There is a particular kind of loneliness that comes with beginning to individuate. It should be named because it catches people off guard. When you start to peel back the persona, when you start to question the script you've been following and to listen to what's actually true for you, the people around you don't always celebrate it. Sometimes they feel threatened by it. Sometimes the relationships that were built on the old version of you become strained. And in the early stages of this work, before you have built a stable enough sense of your own interior to trust it, you can feel profoundly unmoored. The old certainties are gone. The new self is not yet consolidated. You are, to use Jung's own metaphor, between deaths and births. But the alternative Jung kept coming back to in case after case in his clinical work, is quietly devastating. The person who never individuates doesn't simply stay comfortable. They contract. They become more rigid, more defended, more brittle. The mask becomes tighter, and the face underneath it becomes less distinct. The life that wasn't lived doesn't remain neutral. It accumulates. It becomes depression, or rage, or a vague, corrosive dissatisfaction that bleeds into everything without ever quite having a name. The midlife crisis, in its least understood form, is often this: the unlived life demanding, finally, to be lived. Jung once wrote something that has stayed with me in a way few things have. He said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. He said it plainly, almost simply, for a man who could be extraordinarily dense and difficult. But in that simplicity, something immense. A privilege, not an obligation, not a self-improvement project, not a metric to be tracked. A privilege, something rare, something that not everyone will claim or even know to want. Most people spend their lives becoming better at being what the world wanted them to be. And there is something honorable in that. There is love in it sometimes. Love for family, for community, for the people who need you to be reliable in specific ways. But alongside that, if you are lucky, and if you are brave enough, there is another project running parallel, quieter, more subterranean. The slow, patient, sometimes painful work of becoming yourself. Not the self that was constructed for you, not the self that keeps everything smooth and everyone comfortable, the self that was there before the construction began, the one that existed in flashes of genuine feeling, in moments of unexpected joy, in the things that moved you before you learned to be cynical, in the anger you were told was unacceptable, in the longing you were told was self-indulgent. That self hasn't gone anywhere. If you felt something watching this, some recognition, some discomfort, some quiet ache at the back of your chest, that is not nothing. That is worth paying attention to. Not because I can tell you what it means for you specifically. No one can do that. That is the whole point. But notice it. Sit with it. Don't rush immediately to explain it away or resolve it into something manageable. Let it be, for a moment, exactly what it is. A signal from some part of you that has been waiting, patiently or not so patiently, to be heard. That is where individuation begins. Not with a theory, not with a program. With a moment of honest attention to what is actually happening inside you, right now, underneath everything you're supposed to be feeling. Jung called it becoming who you truly are. Others have called it different things, but the experience is recognizable across all the names. It is the shift, sometimes sudden, more often gradual, when you stop mistaking the costume for the person. When you realize that's the mask, and underneath it, stranger and more interesting than anything you've curated, is you.